We welcome to Grieving Through the Stages of Dementia. As always, this webinar is brought to you by a collaboration of sponsors, O'Connor Mortuary, who is also providing our wonderful speaker today, Care Choices, Hospice and Palliative Services, Caring Companions at Home, and Alzheimer's Orange County Memory Support Services. My name is Kim, and I'm with ALS OC, and I'll be your host again today, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Our sponsors, as you know, are providing these webinars to us as a service to the community, and we bring you topics that we hope are beneficial for anyone who's working in the field, as well as family members who are caring for someone. And we hope that you find today's presentation informative and useful. And I think you will, because today our presenter is going to be Becky LaMacca. We're bringing her back by popular demand. She is Ms. Becky LaMacca, and she's the Director of Grief Support and Education at O'Connor Mortuary. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in counseling psychology, and certification in thanatology. Becky is an expert in the field of death and bereavement with 2 decades in nonprofit senior care before joining O'Connor Mortuary in 2013. Becky serves on the board of directors for the Association for Death Education and Counseling, the international professional organization dedicated to promoting excellence and recognizing diversity in death education, care of the dying, grief counseling, and research in thanatology. She also serves on the Trust Institute Committee for Selected Independent Educational Trust, whose focus is to bridge the educational gap between mortuary science school and on-the-job training. Locally, she serves on the board of directors for Newport Mesa Irvine Interfaith Council, the Advisory Council for the Trauma Intervention Program, and she's past board chair for Hearts and Hope Family Grief Center. Becky, as you'll see, is passionate about educating the community on how to cope with death and the journey of grief after loss. Her true passion lies in normalizing the grief experience for all of us and helping to create a world in which grief is embraced, understood, and respected. And so with that, I'd like to invite our speaker, Becky, to join us. Hi, Becky.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kim. So great to be back with Alzheimer's Orange County and the wonderful collaborative of sponsors and be able to present on this really important topic today, grieving through the stages of dementia. So here's what I'm hoping to accomplish over the next 55 minutes or so with all of you. I want to just talk about the normal grieving process, explore how normal bereavement can potentially become complicated due to a dementia diagnosis. We'll look at some practical coping strategies for both ambiguous and anticipatory grief. And then throughout, I really want to provide all of you with tools to support persons with dementia who are grieving, and to really to support the caregivers also who are grieving as their person is progressing in this disease. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk first about the truths about grief. So what is grief? Grief is a normal response, a normal reaction to loss. It's natural. Every single one of us grieve, and it is something that we don't get out of this world without doing. We all experience grief in our lives. It's a multifaceted process. Grief is very multidimensional. It's physical, it's emotional, it's spiritual, it's cognitive, it's social, it's all of these things combined. And it is a very, very personal experience. Dr. Ken Doka and Dr. Martin, several years ago, they initially set out to write a book about how men grieve. And what they realized in their research, it wasn't so much about how men grieve, but it's about how all of us grieve very differently on this spectrum. And in doing their research, they discovered that all of us sit on this spectrum of our grief, and we tend to grieve how we live. And at the two ends of the spectrum, they had instrumental grievers and intuitive grievers. Most of us, we fall somewhere, maybe one toward the other, but somewhere toward the middle, somewhere on that spectrum. And so what's an instrumental griever? That's somebody who grieves by doing. And what's an intuitive griever? That's someone who grieves by expressing his or her emotions. And we're going to talk a little bit about this as we move along the presentation today. And then lastly, we always grieve in some way. I think especially early on when someone is experiencing grief due to a death of someone they love, they'll ask me, when is this going to end? When am I going to be over my grief? And the thing with grief is we're never truly over it. We never stop grieving because we never stop remembering that person. We never stop sharing stories about that person. Even though that person isn't physically here with us anymore, that person doesn't just cease to exist. So we do always grieve. However, our grief looks really different over time. And for most of us in our normal grief process, those edges start to soften a little bit, and that pain, it starts to diminish, and we have more happy memories than tears. But there's a little bit of us that will always, always, always experience that grief and feel that loss. What about when we're grieving an illness that cannot be cured? Living and caring for a person with dementia, it's an agonizing experience for many family members. Move that out of the way, make sure you guys can see this. And especially for the caregivers, it can seem impossible to find a silver lining. It can be so difficult at times. We are struggling to put one foot in front of the other. And we're grieving many, many things. We're not grieving just the diagnosis. We're grieving that diagnosis when we first get it. As the disease progresses, we're grieving the finances that have been impacted because of the disease. We're grieving the loss of abilities, both the caregiver and the person with the disease. Grieving the loss of memories. Grieving when a move is necessary. Grieving the health of our loved one, either temporary or permanent changes, and grieving our own health. Many caregivers will talk about healthcare issues that they experience because of their role. And then we grieve when someone dies, regardless of that relationship. So how do we accept these losses? Well, one thing, and it seems kind of simple, is we want to talk about a morning ritual. So what would that morning ritual look like? Well, it really depends on you. A morning ritual of kindness. So think about that. What could you do each morning to be kind to yourself? Is it, I'm going to take 5 minutes and have that hot cup of coffee? Is it going to be, I'm going to spend 2 minutes lying in bed and practicing my gratitude? Is it going to be that I'm going to make sure I eat breakfast in the morning rather than just getting up and going? Think about what your morning kindness ritual is. And then think about naming your stressors. And these are going to change on a daily basis. They may change on an hourly basis. Name the stressor. Sometimes, even if we don't have a solution for that stressor, simply by naming it helps take the wind out of the sails and helps us get through that day. And then I'm going to talk a lot today about social connections. It is so important that we do not isolate ourselves as the caregiver, as the person living with that disease, and that we maintain those social connections to help us through this process. Anticipatory grief. So you'll read here, what is anticipatory grief? This is grieving before a death loss has occurred. So especially with dementia, we're grieving this illness as it's happening. We're grieving the change in the relationship with the person who has the disease. We're grieving the change in relationship within our own family members, and we're grieving the change in relationship within those social connections. We're grieving who that person once was. We're grieving who we once were. And we're grieving the pain of having to watch a loved one suffer. So what are some practical strategies? Time. It sounds so simple, yet time is a wonderful gift as we're experiencing anticipatory grief. And storytelling. Storytelling is such a natural part of how we grieve. And think about storytelling. When someone we love dies, we come together as community, right? We share stories. We tell about that person's life. We tell how we maybe would tell the family member how that person enriched our lives as we're coming as a support person to a funeral or a memorial service. Storytelling as we're experiencing anticipatory grief is also so important for us to be able to manage some of these feelings of grief. And then recognizing role transition. We're telling the stories, we're thinking back, we're remembering, but we're also accepting that role transition is a part of this journey that we're on. I may be daughter, but I may turn into full-time caregiver too, where mom always had the advice for me and she was my go-to person. That may change over the course of this disease. Maybe mom isn't that person, and I'm grieving that role transition, yet I'm also embracing it, and I'm realizing how can I take this new role that I'm in, I don't want to be in, but I'm in, and make it work for me. And then resolving unfinished business. There's a lot of anxiety in grief, and we need to take this time to talk through what's unfinished on my end, what's unfinished on the person's end who has this disease. And sometimes as the disease progresses, we might not be able to verbally resolve unfinished business, but we can do so through writing, through journaling, through letter writing, and maybe it's just to ourselves, but really important to help us on this journey as we're experiencing this anticipatory grief. And I also want to talk about ambiguous loss. So this type of loss, this type of grief we experience is when someone has dementia. Our ambiguous loss is that the person is physically here, yet they may not be mentally or emotionally present in the same way as before the dementia. So this is a real grief. Unfortunately, our society does not always accept this type of loss and all of the things that go along with this. Often well-meaning friends will say, yes, but, and it's okay because, and they'll try to fix it for us, well-meaning because they want to see us happy again. But the fact of the matter is, this is a really unique and very, very common grief that we experience. And it creates this anxiety, it creates this stress because there's so much ongoing uncertainty, right? We don't know You know, especially those of us, I'm a planner. I like to have everything planned out. And this disease does not always allow us to do that, right? We don't know what's coming next. We don't know necessarily how this disease is going to progress. And that uncertainty causes so much anxiety. And it really, this ambiguous loss, this ambiguous grief has the potential for loss stacking. And what does that mean? Well, that's loss after loss after loss after loss. We're feeling all of these things. Again, we're grieving that anticipatory grief, right? We're grieving this diagnosis. We're grieving the change, maybe in our own bodies if we're the person with dementia, or as we see our loved one change. For those of us who are caregivers, we're also grieving the stress of finances. We're grieving the potential of, what am I going to have to do next? Is he going to have to leave home? Is he going to have to go into boarding care? So all of these things coming together. And while distraction can certainly serve purpose at times as we're grieving, sometimes we just want to set it aside, and distraction can be really good, but it's not a long-term solution for us. So let's talk about some ways that we can help cope with this ambiguous loss. Well, first of all, we need to remember that the present does not replace the past. And a little bit later on, we're going to talk about both and versus either or. So the present doesn't replace the past. Can we reflect on the past through our storytelling? Absolutely. But can we go back? We can't. We are where we are now. And remembering that the illness is not the person. Really important, leaning into our grief. And I know it sounds counterintuitive, and I talked a little bit about those moments of distraction. You know, I'm going to dive into work, or I'm going to clean my closet, or I'm going to scrub the floor, or I'm going to go on a long hike. Those distractions absolutely serve a purpose to put us in a good mindset, to focus on our mindfulness. But one of the most important things we can do is to actually lean into our grief. Create a safe place for yourself and allow yourself to simply grieve. Sometimes people feel that selfish. Well, I have too much to do. I have too many things to focus on. I don't have time. I don't have time to focus on me right now. Give yourself that time. Lean into your grief. Acknowledge your grief. Talk about it honestly. It can really be powerful, and it can help us connect to others. For those of you who are professional caregivers who are coming alongside somebody with dementia, or you are coming alongside somebody who is a family caregiver for somebody with dementia, help the family caregiver know that things don't always happen in the order that we expect them to. And not everyone processes information in a linear way. You know, help them that, you know, like some days are going to be upside down, and that grief, and remind them how grief often works, that we're fine for 1 minute, and then maybe that memory flashes into our minds and we're in tears the next minute. You're not going crazy. You're not doing it wrong. That is simply grief. And then remind them that it's okay to understand logically the progression of the disease, but emotionally just not be able to handle it. And remind them that you are there to support not only the person with dementia, but you are there to support them as well. That connecting with others is so important. And then as we grieve through the stages of dementia, we're also grieving non-death losses. So we have the loss of our roles. We talked a little bit about that, right? Transition of roles. We're grieving loss of independence. And this is for people who have the disease and for family caregivers. Loss of the relationship as we know it, right? The relationship changes. Loss of autonomy. We're grieving the illness itself, and maybe illness that this disease has brought on for the caregiver, maybe high blood pressure, maybe anxiety, other things that are happening for the caregiver, financial losses. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about secondary losses. So a secondary loss is a loss as a result of the disease itself. And these combined with the grief that we're already experiencing due to the other losses, so that ambiguous grief, that anticipatory grief, these secondary losses can make us feel like we're losing everything and that the pain will go on forever and ever, and it will never get easier. One thing about secondary losses is sometimes we grieve these losses more than maybe the death of our loved one or the diagnosis of the disease itself. A lot of times we would consider these more significant losses. Doug Manning, in his book, Don't Take My Grief Away From Me, writes about grieving the death of his wife, while at the same time he was losing his eyesight due to macular degeneration. And he talks about this enormous guilt that he felt, that he was at certain times on his grief journey grieving the loss of his eyesight more than he was grieving the death of his wife. And he had to stop himself and realize that the grief was grief, that he could not necessarily prioritize which one was more significant than the other. And what he found is that when he stopped prioritizing his grief and he allowed himself to grieve at that particular moment, one particular loss, he felt his anxiety reduce significantly. So think about that. You may feel enormous amount of guilt if you're grieving one of these secondary losses and you're feeling like, gosh, I'm not putting priority where it needs to be. Give yourself permission to grieve that secondary loss. It's not an either or situation. It did not mean he was not grieving the death of his wife, and that was not a significant, very traumatizing moment of his life. It simply meant that losing his eyesight brought on a whole new group of secondary losses. So it's okay. Give yourself permission to grieve all of the things that you're grieving. So practical strategies for grieving these non-death losses and these secondary losses. Name your emotions and don't label them as good or bad. So when we name an emotion, it doesn't give that emotion more power, it gives us more power. So name your emotions. Don't say, oh my gosh, I'm feeling, and this is something that a lot of people who are experiencing anticipatory grief, living with someone who has the diagnosis of dementia, they don't allow themselves to feel joy. Or if they do feel joy, they have an enormous amount of guilt. Don't label your emotions as good or bad. Simply allow yourself to feel them. Engage in calming activities. We talked a little bit about that morning kindness routine for yourself. If you are a caregiver, find something that is calming for you. Move your body, whether it's going for a walk, just walking around your apartment or condo or home, spending some time out in the backyard, meditating, praying, going for a walk on the beach, whatever it may be, engage in calming activities. And practice gratitude. Gratitude, even during the worst days. There are so many studies on the practice of gratitude that finding 3 things every day to be grateful for can change our mindset and can help us get through the day. And it may be as simple as, you know what? I got out of bed this morning. I put one foot in front of the other, or it's 9 o'clock at night and I made it through the day. Find something to be grateful for. And then stop the blame game. We have so much guilt surrounding grief because we think we need to be doing it in a certain way. And Sadly, I would love to be able to tell you, do A, B, C, and D, and you're going to be fine on your grief journey. Unfortunately, none of us have that strategy. It is so individualized. But one thing you can do to move forward in your grief is to stop blaming. Stop blaming yourself. And again, leaning into your grief, allowing yourself to feel it. That's what grief is, right? It's moving forward. It's a process of adaptation. It's learning to integrate this loss into our lives and continue to move forward, not back. We can't go back to what it was before, but we can certainly move forward and incorporate it, integrate it into our lives. And then finding support. So many times we want to do this on our own, or we feel shame. Another thing, stopping that blame game. We feel shame. I should be able to do this. I can't, I feel guilty that I would have to ask somebody else to help me. I've always been an independent person. Find support and know that support, especially for you family caregivers, finding support is your act of caregiving. So important to find that support. You know, my simple analogy is this webinar today. You saw the sponsors who put money toward these monthly webinars to make this happen. We have Kim as our facilitator. She has her role. She's making sure everybody gets their CEUs, that everything's working properly, can ask the questions that you may have of me. We have our behind the scenes people who are the technical experts who make sure that this goes flawlessly and everybody can log on and I can advance my slides. And then we have me, the presenter. Does it make my role any less important? Absolutely not. But if I had to do this on my own, if I had to make sure I logged everybody in and sent your CEUs and make sure that the technical side was working and look at the questions that you log in and be able to answer them, it would be overwhelming for me. So don't make it overwhelming for yourself. Find that support. So let's talk a little bit about grief as a caregiver. So we have the power. We have the power of our own narrative on our grief journey. So look at all of these things. You know, we talked about some of them: guilt, burnout, relief. That's an interesting one, right? Sometimes there's a sense of relief when our person dies, and people have an enormous amount of guilt about that. It's okay. That's a normal, again, we're not labeling that as good or bad. We're simply acknowledging it. Shame, physical illness, fluctuating emotions, anger, sadness, anxiety. We could go on and on with this list, but we have the power of our own narrative on our grief journey. When we share, how we share, when we choose to let life distract us from our grief, even if for a brief moment, and then when we choose to lean into our grief. So think about that. You have the power as a caregiver. You have the power of what you want to share, when you want to share it, how you want to share it. You choose when you need that distraction from your grief. You choose when you want to lean into that grief. So Kate Bowler is the author of the New York Times bestseller, No Cure for Being Human. And she had this beautiful quote in her book: "There's fellowship among the afflicted, and it's marked by silence." I'm going to let you sit with that for a brief second. I'm going to read it again. There's fellowship among the afflicted, and it's marked by silence. You know, we just spent some time talking about the need for support, right? For that social support, sometimes for that caregiving support. Marked by silence. So many times as caregivers, we're silent. We feel like we need to go it alone. We feel like we can't share with anybody else. The grief the pain that we're feeling. So let's talk about some practical strategies as a caregiver who is grieving somebody that we love who has a dementia diagnosis. So caregiving is emotionally, physically, and spiritually exhausting. Don't should yourself. Don't tell yourself, I should be doing better. I should be making these decisions. I should be able to handle this. That kindness ritual that you're going to start every morning, add don't should yourself to that. Take time to care for you. Take a 1-minute break. Plan your day out on paper. Now, it may not go anywhere near according to how you want to plan or how you planned it out, but sometimes just physically writing out a plan helps us stay centered. Create that ritual. Maybe you're not a morning person. Maybe that's not your time. Maybe it's 2:00 in the afternoon and you're going to have a cup of tea, or you're going to sit and take time for you. Respite is a necessity, not a luxury. We need respite. As caregivers, we need respite. Here at O'Connor Mortuary, we often talk with our team about replenishing themselves. And what do you do? What healthy strategies do you have for yourself outside of our work here? We are with people who are grieving deaths of loved ones 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And one of the things we always say to our team is refill, replenish yourself. You cannot pour out of a vessel that is empty, right? We can't pour out of a vessel that is empty. We can't care for someone else when we're depleted ourselves. So not a luxury, not a, oh my gosh, again, that guilt and that I shouldn't need this. You do need this, and you are a better caregiver when you do take time for yourself. And we talked a little bit about acknowledging our emotions, right? Leaning into our emotions, leaning into our grief, and acknowledging without labeling them good or bad. And I want to talk just a little bit about this concept of either or and changing it to both and. So think about this. I'm a caregiver, or I can take time for myself, right? What if we change that to I am a caregiver and I focus on self-care? What if we look at our role in the transition? Early on, we talked about that ambiguous grief and that transition of our roles. My spouse and I don't have the relationship now. Now I don't feel like I'm a spouse anymore. Now I'm just a full-time caregiver. What if we changed that and we said, I am a caregiver and I am a spouse? Our relationship has changed. I am a spouse. I'm both. And what about this? I miss that person that was, right? We miss that person that was. It pains us. It causes us heartache to see this disease progress and the person who we knew so well change. What if we reframe that and we say, I love my person with dementia as they were and as they are now. I love my person as he or she was and as he or she is now. And then reminding yourself that you are doing your best based on the situation that is in front of you. So that and or two. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't know if I can do this. And I know that I'm doing the best I can do at this moment in time based on my particular situation. So think about that. Let that sit with you for a minute. Not either or. Think of it as both And again, assessing your support system. Who is that one person? All of us in our grief should have that one person that I could pick up the phone and call, that I could text, that I could say, hey, you know what, can you come on over? Who's your person? Who's your person who can listen to understand versus listen to react? So many times, well-meaning friends and family members want to fix this for us, and we don't have the opportunity to fix what we're going through. This is a disease that is progressing, and this person will die as a result of this disease. So who is your person? Who are your support system? And then assessing the support system that you may need now and you may need in the future. Again, reminding those of you who are family caregivers that you're not failing when you seek the support that is available. We have a gift here in Orange County through Alzheimer's Orange County. Take advantage of the resources they have available. Be okay with the fact that although you're grieving the transition, it may be best for you, for the person with the disease, to have a professional caregiver come into your home, or move to one of our wonderful 6-bed boarding cares or assisted livings to help you be a better caregiver and to help that person lead the best quality of life regardless of how much time he or she has. For those of you who are supporting family caregivers, it's okay to say, you know what? I'm uncomfortable. Maybe you don't know what to say. It's all right. You know what? I'm uncomfortable, but I'm willing to sit with you in this space. I'm willing to sit with you in this uncomfortableness so that you can be heard. You know, Doug Manning, who I talked about, his book, Don't Take My Grief Away From Me, was also in his book, he talks about these emotional buckets that we have and how as supporters of those who are grieving, we can't just simply fill up that other person's bucket with platitudes to make ourselves feel better, because all that is going to do is just overflow. They don't have space. Their bucket is already full. What we need to do is we need to physically get in that bucket with that person and say, hey, you know what? I might not have all of the answers, but I'm here for you. He talks about hanging around, hugging them, and hushing, simply allowing that person to be heard in that space. And allow yourself to be changed by it. Allow yourself to be changed by this grief. New feelings, new fears, most certainly, yet also sometimes new perspectives, new routines and rituals that sometimes are not what we want, and then new ways of communicating. These all are changes. These are all things that we're grieving. Allow yourself to be changed by it. Give yourself the ability to choose your response to your own narrative. Find moments of joy. Find moments of calm. Admit the sorrow and the pain. Is it going to take the grief away? No. It's not going to, but it's going to allow you to take that grief and bring it with you as you're on this journey, as you're moving toward this new situation that you're in. The goal is never to go back to what was, although so many times that is what we desperately want, right? And we can use that storytelling to remember and to have those happy moments of remembering what was. But the goal is not to go back to what was. The goal is to move forward despite the adversity, despite the grief. We take that with us. Sometimes we tuck it away, and then we decide when we want to pull it out, when we want to communicate with others, when we want to lean into that grief, and who we want to share it with. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about supporting people with dementia who are grieving. So especially early on in a diagnosis, lots of concern, right? Am I going to lose my dignity, I'm feeling this loss of self-worth. I'm losing my mobility, maybe as the disease progresses, the loss of housing, all of these things this person with dementia is experiencing. And then as the disease progresses, agitation and restlessness, loss of memory, loss of words, loss of ability to do certain things for ourselves. And we also experience death losses too. People with dementia experience death losses, and the dementia complicates their ability to realize or accept the loss. Barbara Carnes, who is a registered nurse and a longtime hospice nurse and really an expert on being with people who are dying. She states, everyone has the right to be told they can't be fixed, to be given the opportunity to address the loose ends of their life. There is so much healing and connection that will be missed if we don't acknowledge the disease process and that death is approaching. Right? We all deserve the right to be told that we can't be fixed. So in the early stages of dementia, encourage the person with dementia to talk about their fears, to express their wishes, how did they want to live with this disease, and what their plans are for the future. I like to ask questions of who, what, where, and when. I try to avoid why, because often so many times if I ask why, it even though I may be well-meaning, it has a connotation that maybe I'm judging. So I try to stay away from that. It allows that person dignity, right? We have that right. We should be able to focus on what we know we can't fix, but have a right to share it. It gives the person the ability to feel some control when they feel like they've lost all control of their life. When the disease progresses and the person has difficulty expressing their feelings surrounding the loss, focus on what the person can do. Years ago, before I came to O'Connor, and I worked in adult day healthcare, the adult day healthcare that is now run by Alzheimer's Orange County. I had a gentleman who had dementia, and he, due to a stroke, and he was not able to speak or to hear anymore. So we focused on, he came to the day program and his wife was so overwhelmed. She was grieving this brilliant man who was. I mean, he was a beautiful orator. He had a brilliant mind, was a professor, and to see him not be able to speak, she was grieving that loss. And so what we did is through art, he was able to express himself. He painted. He painted every single day. He painted to be able to communicate with those of us on staff at the Adult Day Healthcare Center. He painted to be able to communicate with his wife. And I don't know if you can see behind me on the wall, but that's one of his paintings. It's been, gosh, probably 15 years since I've been at the Adult Day Healthcare Center, but I keep that painting with me. So focusing on what the person can do. Acknowledging their grief and listening to understand. We can't fix it, right? So many times like, well, let me tell you how I can make it better. No, listening to understand, and then making meaningful connections. How can this person continue to make meaningful connections? Again, find that support, find those resources that are in the community. Is it support group? Is it the music group through Tremble Clefs, where the caregiver and the person with disease can play music? Is it going to one of the faith community worship services that Alzheimer's Orange County puts on, making those meaningful connections? And then let's talk a little bit about the person who has dementia who experiences a death loss. Tell the news about the death. We need to tell the person about the death. So many times I'll have family members say, well, I don't know if I should tell mom. She has dementia. I don't know if I should tell her that dad died. Tell the news and answer the questions as honestly as possible. Use very clear language and try not to protect the person from the truth. Well-meaning, but try not to protect. About a year and a half ago, we had a gentleman who his brother died. His mom was in her mid 90s and had pretty advanced dementia, moderate to advanced dementia. He was unable to tell his mom that his brother died. He just couldn't do it. He wanted to protect her from the truth because he was so afraid how it was going to affect her. So they actually asked me to sit with the family and be with the mom with dementia to let her know that her son had died. And that's exactly what I did. I used clear language. I answered the questions that she had, and I told her the truth. I said, I'm here to let you know that your son has died. And the son who is living was so concerned that his mom would not be able to accept the death. And she did. Was she sad? Absolutely. It was her son. But yet the relief on the son's face, in his soul, that caregiver, to be able to tell his mom the truth was a gift that I was so happy I could be a part of, except how they want to talk about the person who has died, right? I was just talking with a coworker whose mom has dementia, and her husband, his dad died, oh gosh, probably 20 years ago. And now where his mom is in her disease process, she wants to talk about her husband and how he died. And so we talk about that. We talk about how it's okay for him to accept that, because he has the tendency to want to say, well, mom, that happened 20 years ago. Mom, I don't know why you're bringing this up now. And sometimes what we need to do is just sit back and listen, right? Accept how that person wants to talk about the person who has died, and then responding to the emotions under the words. I think this is so important. I think so many times we want to focus on, well, you don't have that right. This is what happened. No, he didn't die yesterday. He died 20 years ago, mom. No, he's not still living. Dad died 20 years ago. And we talk about this. I talk about this with my colleague, that it's not about responding to the words. It's responding to the emotion under the words. Oh my gosh, I can see you're really upset about this. Tell me about this. And that comes into that storytelling again too. Can you share your favorite memory? Tell me again how you and dad met. Tell me about that when you got married. So respond to the emotion underneath the words. And then sharing your own feelings and being patient with yourself too. It's hard, especially if you have somebody who is reliving the news of the death over and over and over again. It's okay. Who's your one person? Find that one person and say, you know what? Today was a really challenging day. I had to talk with mom 6 times about dad dying. Be patient with yourself too. Remember that slide a few slides back. We're doing the best we can in our given situation. So taking in the good, we've talked about a lot of these things. Susan Cain, in her book Bittersweet, states that we live in a world that only wants us to talk about the good, right? We only want to talk about the good. I tell this my teenage kids all the time with social media. This is not reality. Anything is not going well. It's positioned as a detour from the main road. Remind yourself that in all reality, pain is a part of the road we walk as humans. Taking in the good, practice those restorative things, practice your mind body connected, hold that space for yourself, tolerate the ambiguity, focus on resilient coping. This is hard, but how am I moving forward? Finding hope. The despair, the sadness, the tough moments, the grief is a part of our life. We need to embrace it rather than trying to ignore it. And it's that very dual nature of life, that positive and the negative, that we must embrace. We must embrace both. It's the embracing and the acknowledging of the pain of our grief that helps us grow through it. So remember, don't fight the wave, learn to surf it. Embrace the messiness and focus on ways that you can move forward through your grief.
Okay, Becky, that was extraordinary as always. And we have come to the portion in our program where we invite the audience to put questions in the question box. But as the host, I'm sort of in charge of the timing of this too. So I'm looking at our time, and I think what I'll do is make a few announcements in case people do have to leave right at 12:30. It looks like we are going to run over, Becky, and is that okay with you? You can
That
stay
is
on a little
okay.
bit?
And I will let everybody know my email is up there too. So if we don't get to all of the questions, please know you are more than welcome to email me. And I am happy to talk with you outside of this webinar as well.
That's very gracious of you, Becky. So before we do the question and answers, let me just take a moment to pause and thank our sponsors once again: O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choices, Hospice and Palliative Services, Caring Companions at Home, and of course, Alzheimer's Orange County Memory Support Services. And I also want to alert everyone to our topic next month. We will have a returning presenter once again. Erin Light from Silverado Senior Living is going to be with us to talk about wandering in persons with dementia. So do mark your calendars for Tuesday, June 14th, at once again at 11:30 Pacific time. What else? Don't forget to watch for the survey in case you do have to leave. It's going to be emailed to you if you leave before we end the survey. That's imperative that you fill that out if you're getting CEs, and your CE certificate will then be emailed to you within 7 days. So let's go ahead and let me open up the question box. And real quickly, before, this is selfish, but before I get to everyone's questions, I have a question. I want to ask you, in that discussion, that thoughtful discussion you had about informing dementia individuals about death, is it possible that there's room for another view on that? I think maybe, I'm thinking it's a little bit stage dependent. Certainly for early stage, people have the right to know when their loved one passes away, but I know there's people on the line that might be asking themselves, you know, I've been through that, and the person just keeps grieving and grieving and grieving because they forget about the death. So is it considered ethical to use distraction, perhaps, if someone's asking about a dead spouse? Can we say, he's not here right now, why don't we call him in the morning, or let's go have a bite to eat before we call him, that sort of thing? I wanted you to quickly weigh in on that.
Sure. Well, I think that's where we can focus on responding to the emotion versus the question. So I think that is an opportunity to talk about, oh my gosh, tell me, it sounds to me like you're really thinking about Dad today. Remind me of that story again of how the two of you met. And again, trying to focus on that emotion versus, you know, one more time I have to tell Mom that Dad died 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. Maybe even pulling out some photos and doing some reminiscing.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Becky. Let's see. Just a comment, but I think it's important. This is from one of our attendees. I think it's important to use opportunities to allow people to speak of their experiences in grief. And then she mentions the "this is us" show on television that's been dealing with the dementia of one of their main characters for
Yeah.
several seasons, and how she feels that that's really been a blessing for people that need to learn, more about this. So, yeah, I've been watching that show myself. I don't know about you, Becky.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, the more we can normalize this, that's what we talked about, right? That the afflicted, what we have in common is we do this in silence, right? And I think the more we can create scenarios, whether they're fictional or we have documentaries to show that these are real struggles that people are experiencing, and it is messy. There aren't always right answers. I totally agree. Great. And yes, I have been watching that.
Great. And then there's another question similar. It's along the lines of what I asked, just a little bit more about sharing the death of a loved one with someone who has dementia when they can't remember being told. How many times do you tell them? How many times should they grieve the same loss? And how many times does the caregiver have to relive the telling and the reaction?
Yeah,
A
yeah,
little more about
that's a
that.
great
Yeah.
question. That's and again, we have to be careful not to should ourselves, right? There's no exact number. I think you have to know, and that's why we talk about focusing on the emotion. And it can be very overwhelming for the caregiver. We had one gentleman whose father died, and his mom with dementia wanted to come in every single day and see her husband, view her husband. And every single day it was so painful for him because it was like the first time she had seen him. So we talked about ways for the health of the son, who was the caregiver, that he could speak into the emotion that she was expressing through these questions she had about her husband, so that it wasn't so emotionally draining for him. It's a fine line. I don't think there's a one size fits all, and I don't think there's a one size fits all for even the individual. I think it depends on how they're doing in that particular day, and especially, as you said, Kim, as the disease progresses, that maybe one day it's pulling out the picture book or the album and looking through. Other days it may be having a conversation. Yes, mom, dad did die. And so, as the caregiver, you're going to have to read that and judge that, but thinking about those things to keep in mind to support yourself and to cope. Making sure you have that support system on those extremely hard days, making
Yeah.
sure you are speaking to the emotion.
Yeah. I'm just thinking helpline, I'm thinking support groups.
Yeah.
You mentioned the community resources that are so valuable. Even when you were talking about leaning into grief, I was remembering, that so many of our caregivers tell us there is no time for anticipatory grieving because our loved one is shadowing us all the time. So they'll talk about like crying in the shower, or
Mm-hmm.
screaming into a pillow or whatever. But any opportunity that you have, it just really underscores what you said about respite being a necessity, not a
Mm-hmm.
luxury, because you do
Mm-hmm.
need that time away to process this as it's happening. So Alzheimer's Orange County has an after dementia support group for people who have lost their loved one to the disease, but a lot of communities, your community may have grief groups that you can look into. And that reminds me, Becky, someone's asking about books and other resources that you mentioned. Is there a reference? I think I saw a reference slide.
I do have a reference slide, and
Is
if
that
if
in
I
the,
did, and I don't think I listed all of those books. So if
okay,
you are interested, email me, and I will make sure.
okay.
I think there are a couple of the books I did not share. I will certainly share those books with you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Becky. Okay, so the questions aren't getting any easier. It's a difficult topic, and this is really more sharing. But one of our participants is saying, my mother, who I took care of for 5 years, 24/7, died sooner than we thought. But I still feel like we didn't have enough time. And I feel like I lost a whole side of my body because
Mm,
stopping the care was so abrupt. as I did not know she would pass when she did. How do I go on day to day? I'm still young, and how do I go on? And
Oh
so,
gosh. What a wonderful question, and my condolences to you on your loss of your mom. Gosh, I think, Kim, that could be a whole session, right? A whole session on grieving the death loss of somebody who we were the primary caregiver. um, yes, there is never enough time, right? There's never enough time. Um, Journaling, painting, if you're not a writer, maybe taking photos and putting photos together. Give yourself that time, be able to be present. That's where we lean into our grief, right? And it's okay to take that moment when it's right for you and lean into it. Open up that grief box and give yourself that time. Have those memories. And the other thing I think we can do is, with that time when we lean into our grief, is share with ourselves, whether it's through writing, through another medium, what we wish we did have. I needed more time, and here's why. I needed more time because I wanted this to happen and I wanted that to happen. And allow yourself to go down that path and grieve. You're not only grieving the death, you're grieving the loss of what you never got to do. And then again, finding that support, finding those support groups, other people who are not walking in your shoes and are not experiencing your grief, because your grief is unique, but who can come alongside you to say, I don't have all the answers, but I get it. I get it. And here's what worked for me.
thank you, Becky. And I'm just going to take the liberty of saying to this person, expressing my own condolences to you personally in the loss of your mother. And, there's like 300 people on the line with us today, and I know that you'll be in many of their thoughts and prayers. So do call our helpline. We'd like to talk to you. Another comment, this was the most valuable webinar for anyone dealing with loss and grieving, even past grief journeys and ongoing guilt. Becky is brilliant, intuitive, and gentle.
Well, my goodness. Thank you. Thank you for your very kind words. I appreciate that.
Very kind words, and true. What if you, as a caregiver part-time, do think you are partially at least responsible for him or her having the disease? I don't know whether they're talking about Alzheimer's specifically or some other condition. What if you feel partially responsible?
Yeah, gosh,
Is that possible?
that's a tough one. Well, I think it can be, and with death losses too, we have certain situations where we maybe think, even if it's that logical versus emotional that we talked about, right? Logically, we know, well, I didn't do this. But emotionally, we feel like, oh my gosh, did I do something wrong? Could I have done something different? What if I had a do-over? And that's a tough space to be in. I would say certainly reach out, find support. Even beyond support groups, there are some wonderful grief specialists who can help people find ways to work through some of that feeling of guilt and shame that, oh my gosh, did I cause that, and help you see that more logical side that, no, this isn't the case.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about that logical side as well. And I'll just make a kind of a blanket statement about dementia. You can't be responsible for someone else having dementia. And, we spend a lot of time just working with the individuals who are diagnosed, trying to, let them know that they didn't bring this on, that most cases are random. A few are genetic, but most are random. So it's hard for me to think of any way that you could be responsible for someone else having the disease. So, okay. More accolades for you, Becky, that I'll share later. And, more folks just writing about their own grief process and how to process that grief. And I think, Becky, you've done an excellent job of giving strategies for that. And, everybody hang on to Becky's slides and hang on to, the information about community resources. This person had lost their mother-in-law 5 years ago, and she's still not over it. So maybe you could address, like, instead of fresh grief, maybe talk about if the grief happened at a time in the past and you're still struggling.
Sure. And I will say to you, there is no timeline. And the goal is never to get over grief. The goal is to, again, integrate that loss into our lives and move forward. Some of us move forward at different paces than others. So again, giving yourself that space to grieve. It's been 5 years. That's okay. That's okay. And it can be 5 years, it can be 20 years, and there could be a song that comes on the radio, or a certain smell from the kitchen, or a cookie or a recipe, something that brings us right back, right? And you can say to yourself, for those of us who have someone who we love die, oh my gosh, I haven't thought about this in 15 years, and all of a sudden, boom, I'm in tears again. So knowing that is very normal too. Our grief never goes away. I would say if you 5 years down the road are having a hard time struggling with day to day, getting out of bed, going to work, those types of things, then go and talk with somebody about that grief. Lean into, call Alzheimer's Orange County, reach out to me. We can get you in touch with a grief specialist. Yet you're grieving the loss, especially if you were a caregiver 5 years. That's okay. That's not unusual.
Yeah. We are running out of time, so let's do one more. Becky, you've just been wonderful. And I think it's important to include this because of the number of professionals that we have on the line. A comment was made, it's hard for a caregiver who's taking care of a resident for a long time and loses them, and they become like family. So can you address that for a moment,
Absolutely.
please, Becky? Thank you.
Absolutely. And that's what we call disenfranchised grief. That's where your grief isn't recognized. Oh, you shouldn't be grieving because that's your job, right? Well, any of us who are in the caregiving world, and this is our profession, we do this because we care so deeply for the people that we're taking care of. We care for so much for our residents. And so these same things apply to you, whether you're a professional caregiver or whether you are a family caregiver. Lean into your grief, acknowledge your grief. Unfortunately, so many times it is disenfranchised because people don't recognize it. And so again, we can maybe feel some shame or some guilt, or what's wrong with me? Nobody else seems affected by it. I should be okay. The other thing I would say is create those rituals. If you are working in an assisted living or a caregiver in a small boarding care home, when one of your residents dies, mark that death, whether it's by, having flowers and maybe the photo of the person, and you each go around for a few minutes and share your favorite memory of your resident. Maybe it's going to the memorial service that the family has put together, whatever it may be for you. But those rituals help us come to terms with the reality of the death, and know that when you are a professional caregiver, you absolutely will grieve the deaths of your patients, your clients, your residents, because you have been such an important part of their life, and they're such an important part of your life.
Thank you, Becky. And with that, we must end, and I will just share the words of one of our participants. She said, all of us, or he said, all of us need to remember that grief is the result of the love we have for someone we lost. And so grief is the price tag we pay when we love. So I want to thank you again, Becky, for this excellent webinar. Thanks again to all of our sponsors and to all of you. And we hope to see you soon at one of our other educational offerings or next month when Aaron Light returns to talk about wandering and dementia. Thank you so much, and watch for your survey.